Okay, so good morning, everyone. Namo Buddhaya. And so we're going to continue with this happiness series. Uh, and we've done 2 sessions so far, a preliminary session, and then a second session where we discussed how to cultivate forgiveness. And we're going to continue the discussion further. And today we're going to discuss how to deal with grief and trauma. So before we proceed, it would be nice to do a short meditation to just calm our minds, just still the chatter in our minds. So like we do for all our sessions, let's start with what is called Anapana Smriti, or mindfulness of breath. So we'll do a mindfulness meditation to help us with our concentration, and then we'll proceed with our discussion. And we'll follow our regular kind of structure for the session. We'll have a short break around 11:15, and then we'll continue. So okay, so just ensure that you have a proper posture. Ideal would be if you have the 7-point Vairachana posture where you're sitting cross-legged, the sole of the feet pointing upwards. And if you're sitting in a chair, then ensure that your back is erect and shoulders straight, arms relaxed. Right palm in the left palm, and the thumbs touching each other, the tip of the thumbs touching each other. And then the head, the chin would be slightly tucked in, and the tip of the tongue resting against the upper row of teeth just behind them. And you could either have your eyes closed or you could have them half open. In which case, if your eyes are half open, just point the gaze of your eyes just down the ridge of your nose in the space in front of you. So, yeah, ensure that you have this posture. And then let's start off by observing the sensations as we breathe in and breathe out in the area between the upper lip and the tip of our nose. So just bring the focus of your mind to that area between the tip of your nose and the upper lip, and observe the sensations as you breathe in and breathe out. Now bring the focus of your mind to your in-breath. Just observe which nostril you're breathing in through, and observe the sensations that you experience there. Okay, now shift the focus of your mind to your out breath and observe which nostril you're breathing out through. And observe the sensations that you experience in that nostril as you breathe out. Now, as you breathe in, just count 1, 1, and as you breathe out, count 2, 2, and then alternate, count till 10. The counting will help you with your concentration. Uh, it makes you aware if you're distracted, and then if you get distracted, some other thought props up, then just return to your counting, start from 1, 1, and then proceed till 10, and then repeat the process again. So 1, 1 as you breathe in, 2, 2 as you breathe out, and then count till 10, and then start over. Okay, now let's do a motivation setting for the session. So just recollect that in this lifetime we've been blessed with the 8 freedoms and the 10 endowments. It makes us very fortunate to be blessed with these kind of conditions, these enabling conditions. But there's no certainty that these enabling conditions would abide. We will be separated from these enabling conditions at the time of death. And there's no certainty that after death we would have a human form again. We'd be reborn as humans. In fact, there's a greater likelihood that we're reborn in one of the lower realms, and then we'll have to suffer, endure the suffering in the lower realms. And we know from our discussion of the lower realms that none of us wants to endure that suffering. So by chance, if we are reborn as humans or gods again in our future rebirth, future lifetime, we also know that even in the human realm, the suffering is immense. There's physical suffering, there's aging, dying, sickness, birth. All these are in the nature of suffering. And there's also a lot of mental suffering, anguish, anxiety, disappointment, frustration that we experience through the course of our lives. Even as gods, there's suffering towards the end of their existence in their respective realms. So, no matter where we are in samsara, there's always suffering. Suffering is just around the corner. And the best way to conduct your spiritual practice is to aim for release from this suffering, aim for release from this cycle of birth and death in samsara. So we should all aim for our liberation. And in this present lifetime, we have been endowed with the proper, favorable, enabling conditions to practice the path towards liberation. But liberation is not a sufficient goal for all of us, since we know that although individually we may be liberated, we will leave behind our dear ones and the rest of the sentient kind in samsara to suffer. And that would not be wise of us. So we should all aim to attain a state where we can not only ensure our own liberation, but also assist other sentient beings in their pursuit of liberation. And we should aspire to develop a capacity which will help us, which will ensure that we can help other sentient beings meaningfully on this path towards liberation. So that capacity is available to us if we attain the state of a completely enlightened Buddha. So we should all aspire for that state of enlightenment. And in our pursuit on the path towards complete enlightenment, we need some guidance, assistance. So we need the assistance of the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So let's all begin by taking refuge in the three jewels, the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. So we do a short refuge. Namo Gurubhya, Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dharmaya, Namo Sanghaya, Namo Gurubhya, Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dharmaya, Namo Sanghaya, Namo Gurubhya, Namo Buddhaya, Namo Dharmaya, Namo Sanghaya. And let's also just recite these verses from the Guru Puja, which remind us about the preciousness of human rebirth and also help us in developing the wish for liberation. So realizing how this body of liberties and endowments is found but once is difficult to obtain and is easily lost, I seek your blessings, my gurus, to partake of its essence, make it worthwhile, and not be distracted by the meaningless affairs of this life. And then to develop the wish for liberation, let's reflect on this verse. Violently tossed amidst waves of delusion and karma, plagued by hordes of watery denizens, the three kinds of suffering, the suffering of change, and the all-pervasive conditioned suffering. I seek your blessings, my gurus, to develop an intense longing to be free from this monstrous ocean of boundless and vicious existence. Let's also recite the Bodhicitta prayer. I go for refuge until I'm enlightened. To the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly, by my practice of giving, ethical discipline, patience, perseverance, meditative stabilization, and wisdom, may I become a Buddha to benefit all sentient beings. Okay, with that, we set a good motivation for the session. So just before we proceed, I'm going to recite a couple of prayers for auspiciousness, to remove obstacles to our spiritual practice. So the first one is the recollection of the three jewels. So I'm going to recite in Sanskrit. It will just take a couple of minutes, so you can just reflect on it as I recite. Suyatapi Buddho Bhagavan Stadagata Ranta Samya Sambuddho Vidyacharan Sampanna Subhuto Lok Vidun Anuttara Purushodhamya Sarati Shasta Deva Manusha Nama Buddho Bhagavaniti Nishan Stadagat Punya Nama Vipranasha Kushala Mulanam Alankrita Chantya Alaya Punya Nidhana Nama Chitrika Vanjanaya Kusumita Lakshaniya Pratirupa Gocharena Pratikula Darshanena Abhirati Shaddadi Mukta Nama Anpibhuta Pradnyan Vamardaniya Baleya Shasta Sarvasatva Nama Pita Bodhisattva Nama Raja Aryabhuta Nama Sartva Nirvana Nagar Samprastita Nama Aprameya Jnanena Chinta Pratibhanena Vishuddha Swarena Swadani Goshina Sachitmurupena Apratismakayana Liptakamena Liptarupena Sanstrarupaya Vipramurtaskandeve Samprutadatu Vya Samrutayataniya Prachuna Granteya उत परिधाने परिमुक्त सृष्णया गादुत्तीर्ण परिपूर्ण ज्ञानेन प्रतिष्ठितो अतीता अनागता प्रतिपन्नानाम बुधानाम भगतां ज्ञानेन प्रतिष्ठितो निर्वाणस्थितो भूतकोटयामस्थित सर्वसत्त्वलोकनीयायाम भौमो सर्वैमे तथागता नाम विशिष्टा सम्यक् गुणः सधर्मस्तु आदौ कल्याण मध्य कल्याण परिवसान कल्याण स्वर्स्यंजन केवल परिपूर्ण परिशुद्ध परिवदात स्वागत भगवत धर्म सादृष्ट निर्जोर कालिक अपने औपनायिक ही कश्यप प्रत्यात्म वेदनीय विज्ञेय स्वागत भगवत धर्म विनय सुप्रवृत्ति नैयानिक संबोधिगामी अभिन्न संस्तुप सप्रतिषण छिन्न प्रोतिग सुपतिपन्न भगवत आर्य संगे न्याय प्रतिपन्न रुचिपतिपन्न सामिच प्रतिपन्न अंजलि करणी सामिच करणी पुण्य क्षेत्र महादक्षिण परिशोधक प्रावण्य आहनीय आर्य त्रिरत्नानुसूति सूत्रम समाप्तम. I'll also recite the Heart Sutra. So, evam ashrutamekasmina samaya bhagwan rajviyo viharati isma grudhukuti parvati mata bhishu sangena sadharma mata cha bodhisattva sangena tena kalu samena bhagwan gambhirava sambodham nama samadhim samapannaha tena cha samena aryavlukteshvara bodhisattva mahasattva gambhirayama pradnyaparmitayama charyama charmana evam vyolokiti isma panchaskandhastanta svashunyana vyolokiti atah Ishmana Shariputra Buddhanubhavena Aryavlukteshwaram Bodhisattva Dochada Yakashin Shariputra Yakashin Kulaputra Gambhirayam Prajnaparmitayam Charyam Chartakamatam Shishitavya Eva Mukta Aryavlukteshwara Bodhisattva Mahasattva Ishamandam Shariputra Meta Dochada Yakashin Shariputra Kulaputra Vakuludita Vasyama Gambhirayam Prajnaparmitayam Charyam Chartakamatene Vyolokitavyam Panchaskandhastanta Svashunyana Samana Pashyati Smarupam Shunyata Shunyataiva Rupam Rupana Pratak Shunyata Shunyadana Pratak Rupam Yad Rupam Sa Shunyata Ya Shunyata Tad Rupam Evam Vedna Sanya Sanskara Vidyanani Shunyata Yam Shariputra Sarva Dharma Shunyata Lakshana Anutpanna Niruddham Lavimlanuna Sampurnaha Tasmatari Shariputra Shunyata Rupam Nivedna Sanyana Sanskara Vidyanam Chakshuna Shotam Ranam Najivana Tayo Namano Rupam Nashabdona Gandona Raso अस्पष्टव्यम न धर्मम न चक्षुर्धातुर यावन न मन धातुर न धर्म धातुर न मन विज्ञान धातु न विद्या न क्षय यावन न जरामरणम न जरामरण क्षय न दुःख समुदय निरोध मार्ग अनन्यानम न प्राप्तिरन तस्मात् ऋषारिपुत्र प्राप्तित्वेन बोधिसत्त्वा नाम प्रज्ञा पारमिताश्रित्य विहरति चित्तावरणस्थित्वात् तत्रस्थो विपर्यासति क्रांत निष्ठ निर्वाण त्रयद्वयस्थित सर्वबुद्ध प्रज्ञा पारमिताश्रित्य अनुत्तराम सम्य संबोधिम अभिसंबुद्धाः तस्माद् ज्ञातव्य प्रज्ञा पारमिता महामंत्र अनुत्तर मंत्र सम मंत्र सर्वदुख प्रशमन मंत्र सत्यमित्यद्वाद प्रज्ञा पारमिता मुक्त मंत्र तद्दागते गते पारगते पारसंगते बोधि स्वाहा एवं शारिपुत्र गंभीरायाम प्रज्ञा पारमितायाम चर्यायाम शिक्षितव्यं बोधिसत्वेन अथ खलु भगवान् तस्मात् समाधेर्विता आर्यावलुप्तेश्वरस्य बोधिसत्त्वस्य साधु कर्मदात साधु साधु कुलपुत्रे मे तत् गंभीरायाम प्रज्ञापारमितायाम चर्याम कर्तव्यं यथा निर्दिष्टमनुमोद्यते तदागतहद्वीदमोच भगवान् आनन्दमना आयुष्यमान् शारिपुत्र आर्यावलुप्तेश्वरश्च बोधिसत्त्व सा च सर्ववति परिषत् सदैव मानुषसुरगन्धर्वश्च लोक भगवतो भाषितमभिनन्दनीति प्रज्ञापारमिता हृदय सूत्रं समाप्तम्. Okay, so that was the Heart Sutra. So let's proceed with our discussion, and so I'll put down some points on the slides. As we discuss the slides, if there's any doubt or anything that you want to add, please feel free to interrupt, and you can raise your hand, and or you can just speak up. If there's any question and you don't want to speak, you can just post it on chat. Okay, so for the discussion, today we're going to our primary focus is to see how to develop an approach or identify an approach to deal with grief and trauma. But in order to identify that approach, we'll have to first identify exactly what is the nature, what is the essence, what are the characteristics of grief, and then grief usually is a response to some sort of a loss. So we'll identify what kind of losses we generally experience, and then what kind of losses trigger grief. And then we'll identify the different types of grief. If there's a certain kind of process, sequential process of grieving, then we'll identify the stages of grief. And then in order to frame an approach to deal with Grief, we'll look at how grief is dealt with in Buddhism. What does Buddhism have to say about grief? And then see if there are specific techniques that we can use to deal with grief. So the first one, what is grief? So would anyone want to, you know, take a guess? And then would anyone want to share their opinion about what grief could be? How could it be defined? Anyone? We've all experienced, right, in the past. Yeah.
Hi, good morning. I don't see a way to raise my hand. Is it okay if I speak? Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Hi, good morning, Venerable, and good morning, everyone. Things that come to mind is a painful suffering response to, like you mentioned, loss already before,
Right.
and essentially things not being the way we want them to be in a very severe way.
Right. So you're talking about response, and you're saying that the response is usually characterized by a lot of pain, and the uh, response is to some sort of a loss. Yeah, that's almost the the definition of grief. Anyone else would want to contribute anything on grief? Anything about what kind of response you have? Pain is characteristic of the response that we experience. Yes. Any other kind of response that we have to a loss?
I think in psychology, they say that there's the stages like denial and anger or fear and things like that. I'm not sure if they are completely valid or relevant.
Right.
But those are some of the things commonly associated, I think.
Okay. So, grief, the response also could be sequential. You're saying first stage could be denial and then followed by other kind of responses, sequential responses. Okay. So I just put down some thoughts here. So grief can be broadly defined as Alice rightly said, reactions to some sort of a loss, and that loss could be of someone dear to us or something that we value, consider precious, or something that we are emotionally invested in, something that we are emotionally connected with. And the response also, so in response to the loss, you could have this intense longing for the uh, loved one's presence. Grief usually associated with the loss of a dear loved one. There are other kinds of griefs also, grief in response to other kinds of losses. Uh, so one may still long for our loved one's presence, long for his or her company. So that is a very typical response to a loss. So there's this intense longing, and you have intense feelings towards the departed, mm, on par with what you would have towards the living loved ones. It could be even more intense, depending on what kind of relationship you had with the person who departed. There's also, in some cases, a feeling of frustration that the dear one's presence is no longer available. So there's this kind of a slightly negative reaction or response to the absence of that person. So you desire, you long for that person's presence, uh, but it's not available anymore. And that kind of leads to some sort of frustration. In some cases, could also manifest as anger. And then you could also have anxiety relating to, triggered by this fear of uh, how one is going to organize one's life, um, because now things have changed. Somebody so close to you, somebody you you were so close to, somebody who was so dear to you, he's departed, and all of a sudden, his absence creates this void in the environment around you, and you all of a sudden kind of start feeling anxious about how you're going to reorganize your life in the absence of that person. Uh, and there's also loss of vigor and vitality. So you feel kind of low, burdened most of the time when the grief manifests. And there's, of course, sadness and usually some sort of a loss of capacity for pleasure. So people around you might be uh, engaging in activities of merrymaking, but you somehow don't feel like being part of those activities. So those are some of the responses that you manifest to a loss. And the function of grief is to make you feel helpless, or it makes you kind of uh, helpless in the helpless when overpowered by all these emotions that manifest, and these emotions are usually kind of triggered when there's a recollection of the person, or you have a memory of his belonging, or you connect with some of the person's belongings, and then memory is triggered, and that triggers a lot of intense emotions, and then those emotions kind of help you make you feel powerless or helpless. And it also has the function of triggering sadness, anxiety, frustration, in some cases, guilt, exactly how we'll see in our discussion. This fatigue, of course, is all these intense emotions are bearing down on you. They can be really stressful, and this leads to a lot of physical as well as mental fatigue. And then it triggers this feeling of loneliness and vulnerability, and also in some cases intense kind of loss of self-worth, depression, and those kind of reactions too. So this is the nature of grief, and its various characteristics. So now let's see what are the different things that different kinds of emotional responses that go along with grief. And then, as we discuss, we'll be able to identify uh, responses that could be uh, useful in cushioning the impact of grief. So I have two categories here. So the one on the left speaks about, identifies the grief attendant clusters. So all the emotions and reactions that go along with grief. And then with your help, I would like to fill out the second column. So as we progress through the discussion, we should be able to identify uh, those things, practices, techniques, or responses that could act as a cushion to the grief that manifests in response to a loss. So we'll fill out the right column later as we progress through our discussion. So the grief attendant cluster, of course, as we've seen, has all these responses. There's reactions, sadness, anxiety, frustration, guilt, fatigue, loneliness and vulnerability, reduced vigor and vitality, and in some cases, very pronounced uh, reduction in the zest for life. So diminished zest for life. So we said grief is a reaction or response to loss. So what are the different kinds of losses that we can think of when we speak of grief? Can you identify some losses? Yeah, anyone? So we spoke of bereavement, as in the loss of a person who is dear to us. So that's one kind of loss. But are there other kinds of losses? Yeah, Alice, go ahead. You don't have to
Okay,
raise your hand. there are just four of us, so
Yes, yeah. I just didn't want to interrupt your speaking, Venerable. So I see in my work two
Mm,
different types of grief that are not the ones that typically come to mind.
mhm.
One of them is people sort of grieving the state of the planet and the ecological crisis and the what like essentially the what it means for the future of humanity and other life on Earth. Like a lot of people are experiencing a grief process around that. Like if they are deeply immersed in the work and the science and the forecasts and so on. And another
Right,
one which is related to it is actually like a grief around the loss of one's own identity. So the first one would be loss of I guess certain conditions for flourishing or some good life
right,
on the planet.
right.
And the
Mm,
other one is the identity in like, for example, if people have certain associations around what they do in their job and that they are a good person and that their good job is doing the right things for the world or so, and then they realize it's not the case, especially about the job part, then their whole self-image shatters and they are grieving that actually.
right, right. Yeah, yeah, yeah. So, grieving um, the potential loss of our what do you say,
Mass
environment.
loss of human life, you could say, maybe mass loss of human life. Yeah.
Okay, mass loss of human life. Okay. So that's grieving in anticipation of. It's actually in progress. I mean, you can see it, but it's not
Mm.
kind of reached a stage where the process has exhausted. And but anyway, yeah, you're right. I mean, that's also a loss that we could grieve. Uh, then you spoke about loss of identity. Yeah, that's also true. That could be one kind of loss. Yes. Any other losses that we can think of? So there are loss of dear ones. The dear ones could include your partner. It could include a parent. Could be your child. A very um, traumatic kind of experience that leads to intense grief. We'll also speak about it extensively in our discussion. And then we can also grieve the loss of a friend, right? All of us right now are grieving the loss of a very dear friend we had. So our guru, our spiritual friend, our Kalyan Mitra, uh, Lama Zopa Rinpoche, passed on uh, last year. So we are grieving the loss. So similarly, I mean, there could be other dear close friends that you could uh, be grieving the loss of. And then you could also grieve uh, loss of property, loss of home. Uh, for example, can we say that the Tibetan people, they've been grieving this loss of home. They've lost their home. So in that sense, also, you can think about this loss in that sense. And of course, you could think about uh, think about this kind of loss in a more kind of usual way where we have invested so much of our time and resources to ensure that we have a proper home to stay in, a proper shelter, and then for some reason you lose it either through a natural calamity or through some other reason, and then that triggers all kinds of emotion because you're so heavily emotionally invested in creating the shelter for yourself, the security for yourself. So loss of home and property also could be trigger to start grieving. And then, of course, we can also grieve loss of health and loss of youth, right? So, uh, if for some, unfortunately, um, let's say we are diagnosed with some serious illness, uh, and that serious illness is without a cure, or it leads to, even if it has a cure, it leads to immense kind of physical compromise, and that all triggers grief in anticipation of that ultimate event. If there's no cure, then of course it would lead to death eventually. So we start grieving in anticipation of that. Not our own health. It could be also a friend's health or a dear one's health. And then, of course, we can also grieve the loss of or the separation. You can also grief could be triggered through divorce and separation, and your loss of a career and security. So you've also invested a lot in building a career for yourself, and then suddenly you find that you're going to be out of your job, and this is part of what Alice had just mentioned, the loss of identity. So you identify. We have this immense, uh, immensely strong tendency to identify ourselves with the profession that we are part of, or the job that we are doing. So any kind of risk of losing the job, losing our career, can trigger uh, the reactions that we just spoke. Also, can trigger grief. So these are some of the losses that we can think of. So bereavement is the most common. So bereavement could be uh, loss of a life partner, loss of a parent, loss of a child, uh, and then loss of a child again could be through choice for some reasons, or could be a natural death, abortion, or whatever. Yeah, and a loss of a friend includes your spiritual friends, divorce and separation, loss of career and security, and loss of a home and property. So these are some of the losses that I could identify. So how do we then identify what kinds of grief these losses trigger? So are there different types of grief? Um, you, any suggestion on this? Do you have different kinds of grief? Um, can we speak of different kinds of grief, or because they have similar kind of reactions or responses, you can't really identify different kinds of grief? What do you say? Or do you have an opinion on this? Different types of grief? Any suggestions on this? Anyone? Shanti? So yeah, different types of grief. You can speak of grief in terms of uh, whether it happens before the actual loss happens, or whether it happens when the loss has already manifested. And we can also speak about grief in terms of the intensity of the responses that manifest. So two different kinds of divisions. So the first one and the second one relate to uh, whether the grieving is pre loss or post loss. So grieving in anticipation and grieving post trauma, the first division. And then based on what kind of responses we have and the intensity of the responses that manifest, we would have what is called loss of pet as well. Bhavana says, yeah, that's also one of the kind of losses that triggers uh, grief. Yeah, that's right. Loss of a pet. Okay, so in terms of the intensity of the emotions that manifest, the responses that manifest, acute grief and subdued grief could be a division. So, what is grieving in anticipation? So, uh, you could find yourself in a situation where someone who is very close to you, a dear one, is diagnosed with a very serious kind of illness or disability, uh, and maybe diagnosed with an illness which is terminal. So you're just kind of anticipating death. So it triggers grief in anticipation, and then you're stressed about if there's a possible cure, then you're stressed about the cure. And if there's no cure, then you're stressed about the uh, eventual death. And of course, it begins with the diagnosis. Uh, the person is diagnosed with this terminal illness. And the grieving kind of manifests the person, because of his illness or disability, is not able to engage in normal routines. So you as a caregiver, or you as a person who is attending to his illness, you'd start grieving, and the grieving would be because of the loss of the normal routines that you collectively together kind of engaged in. And then you grieve in anticipation, and anticipating, of course, if the person is terminal, then you're waiting helplessly for death, and that triggers, that helplessness is a manifestation of the grieving that you're doing. But this kind of grieving also has a potentially positive kind of effect. And what is the positive effect that it could trigger? It makes you aware of death. It makes you aware of the eventual separation, and it gives you some sort of chance to prepare for it, as opposed to a situation where a person who is close to you dies in an accident, in a traumatic kind of incident. Here you at least have the time to prepare yourself for the eventual separation. Then grieving in anticipation could manifest in a failing relationship. So you know that the relationship is going to end at some point. It's kind of heading towards an end, and then all the responses of grieving manifest in anticipation of that eventual event. There's kind of grieving that we experience sometimes at work, or at when you're in school, or you have a long break, and then you got used to a certain kind of routine during the break, and you're not particularly looking forward to go back to work or school. You might not be enjoying it. Particularly at work, it happens. You might have an hostile environment around you, and then you don't look forward to reconnecting with that environment, and then you start dreading that impending return to work after break. And that dreading also can lead to all the different kinds of responses that we just saw. So this is grieving in anticipation. And then there's grieving post-trauma. So you were involved in an accident, and your dear one couldn't survive the accident. You are a survivor of the accident, and then that triggers a lot of intense reactions, responses in the process of grieving. So you could be a survivor of an accident or a natural disaster or any other situation in which either your or someone else's life was threatened or in danger. And then when you recollect that incident, it could trigger a lot of intense emotional responses. So this is grieving post-trauma. And then, as I said, in terms of the intensity of the emotional responses, grief could be acute. And because the emotional responses are very intense, they will interfere with your ability to do your regular routine everyday tasks. And usually this kind of grief, it is accompanied with this thought or this feeling that the loss is still fresh. So this is acute grief. And then there is, of course, subdued grief. So as time goes on, you got a chance to adjust yourself to the change environment, the change world around you. So most of the intense, the distressing emotions or feelings, they start diminishing in intensity. But at the same time, they could still be lingering under the surface and simmering under the surface. And if they meet with the right kind of condition, some sort of a memory of the dear one or some belonging that the dear one possessed, this intense grief could be triggered again by some event. So subdued grief is usually kind of marked by not intense sadness, but some sort of blues. So subdued grief is essentially a phase where most of the intense, distressing feelings or emotions have diminished in their intensity. So these are some of the types of grief that you could identify. Are there any stages of grief that we can think of? Now, usually it's a very personal, individual kind of journey. Grieving is a very individual kind of journey, and uh, the process unfolds quite unpredictably for that person, and it would be different for different people. So grieving is not usually time bound, and then it uh, could be for a long time, could be for a short time in some individuals. Um, and because it is so dependent on the individual's context and environment, it's difficult to kind of identify any kind of stages or phases uh, of grieving. So probably not very easy to identify any stages of grieving. So let's then talk about how we can develop an approach, a framework to deal with grief. First of all, what do you think? Is grieving wholly, thoroughly kind of negative thing? Uh, or is there a positive aspect to it also? Is it something that is thoroughly an object of abandonment? Uh, or is it something that you kind of, you know, could have in a certain degree and live with it? What do you think? Is grief something that needs to be eliminated? Uh, is it some sort of an illness, or what do you think? What's your opinion on that?
It's an interesting question because I think that in the conventional worldview or wisdom, it is considered like a healthy response, actually, right? Or to a degree, that you can be lingering in it in an unhealthy way, but it's considered a healthy response. But when you first ask the question, or when you introduce grief in Buddhism, like the first thought that comes to mind is attachment, and sort of also the eight worldly dharmas and so on. And while I can see that in case of maybe a loved one, there could be some positive elements, like or as in like the grief is there also because of the feelings of love and maybe compassion and other good virtuous emotions, then a lot of it may be also attachment. Yeah. So okay. So I was first gonna say I think it's mainly attachment. It's probably a bad thing, but now that I talk myself through it, it's probably there might be elements. Not sure if in grief itself. Yeah, it could be in grief itself, where it's essentially the trigger may be actually virtuous emotions.
Right. Yes. Yeah, you're right. I mean, grief could be a continuation of the love for your dear one, although he or she is not physically around. It could be a continuation of the love that you had for that person. So in that sense, it's not really such a negative thing. Of course, it it the responses that it leads to sometimes there are certain responses that are negative, and one needs to guard against those kind of responses manifesting. If there's anger or guilt, or this loss of self-worth, and those kind of things, of course, need to be uh, regulated, managed, or those can be we can think about an approach which will help us deal with those, in the sense of help us eliminate those. But maybe we can think about grief as having both positive and negative aspects, and think about an approach which will help us retain the positive aspect and deal with the negative elements of the grieving process. So grief in Buddhism, so Nevin, maybe you want to take a break. Maybe we'll break for 5 minutes, 5-10 minutes, and then we'll reassemble and continue this discussion. So now, essentially, from here on, we're just thinking we'll be exploring if there's an approach that's been specified in the Buddhist scriptures, Buddhist texts, Buddhist practices, uh, an approach to deal with grief. So we'll look at that after the break. Maybe after 5 minutes, let's reassemble. Yeah, Shanti, is that okay? Hello? Shanti?
Sorry, I was on mute. Sorry.
Okay.
Well, yes.
Yeah, take 5 minute
So
break.
when should we get back? It's 11:02 now.
Yes, in another 5, 6 minutes, maybe reassemble. Yeah.
Okay, thank you.
Otherwise, it gets too long. Yeah. Okay. Working it would.
Tough question. And because they seem the prayers are oriented towards the future return and, let's say, reconnecting with
Right.
the Lama and so on, which seems quite different from what people normally call grief. Because I would say that in grief people normally assume that that situation is kind of final and unchangeable and so on, and there's no sense of reconnecting with the person again, although maybe some people may have some religious beliefs of reconnecting somewhere in heaven or so. So I'm actually not sure if I would say that the prayers are part of grief or are not, and I'm curious to hear what you think.
Right. Yeah. So yeah, right. So, but when you say that grief is essentially just response to a loss, so all these responses that it spoke of. I mean, this is also part of the response, right? Um,
Mm,
so in that sense, you know, grief, very broadly defined, is response to a certain loss. So we had this loss, and then we are responding to it by making extensive prayers and dedications. Of course, it is with the wish to be reconnected with his reincarnation. But even for regular people, people do engage in all kinds of funeral rituals, and then later on also they have rituals, especially in the Indian tradition. In the Hindu tradition, there are all kinds of rituals that people do. Um, so
mm,
uh, if we just looked at the definition of response to a loss, maybe it could be considered part of the grieving process. Anyway, so maybe there could be different ways of looking at it. Let's proceed with this grief in Buddhism. So how Buddhism presents grief. We'll look at this through some stories that are mentioned in the sutra. So most of you might have heard about this story about a lady called Kissa Gautami. So as it mentions here on the slide, it says that Gautami was born in a very poor family in the city of Shravasti in North India in Uttar Pradesh. And she was called Kissa because she was extremely lean and thin. Um, and she was born in a very poor condition, poor background, poor household. But later on, she married a person in a rich household, and she had a son. Uh, so the son was, uh, that provided some joy to Kissa Gautami. Uh, she had been going through all kinds of. I mean, she since she came from a poor background, and also because she had this uh, rather unpleasant appearance. She had to face a lot of difficulty in the early part of her life, and then after having a son, she was overjoyed at having this. It gave her some sense of fulfillment, and she was really attached to her child. But at a very young age, at the age of 2 or 3, the child died, and that caused a lot of suffering to her. So the child was the cause of her respect and honor in the family, but the child's death was unbearable for her. And then her response was intense lamentation and lamenting. Uh, and then when people were ready to cremate the child's body, take the child to the cremation ground, Uh, she lost her composure, so she requested people to call a good doctor who could then give her some medicine that would bring the child back to life. Of course, people realized that since she had lost the composure, slightly deranged. Uh, but they didn't know how to console her at her loss. But then some person then suggested to her that the Shakyamuni Buddha, the Buddha is in town in Shravasti, and he's very compassionate, and he's also considered to be a good physician, so he might be able to help you. So she approached the Buddha and narrated a plight to him, and the Buddha saw her plight and asked her to, told her that he will help her, and he asked her to go to the city of Shravasti and get a handful of mustard seeds. But the mustard seeds need to come from a family that has seen no death. So she was overjoyed at this prospect of getting this mustard seeds, and then the prospect of seeing her child come back to life. So she goes to the city, and then she requests for mustard seeds from one family. The family offers the mustard seeds, but then she asks the family whether there is any death in the family. And the person in the household says that, okay, the cousin passed away last year, and then there was some grandfather who passed away. And so he goes on to tell her that there have been several deaths in the family. And then she goes on to another household and asks for mustard seeds, gets the mustard seed. When she asks whether there's been death in the family, she gets a similar kind of response. So she goes from house to house to house to house. And then after a certain while, she realizes that there's not a single household in the city that has not seen death. And she realizes that death does not spare anyone. And having come to this realization, then she realizes the foolishness of her response. And then she gives the body, takes the body for cremation, the dead body of her son, for the last rites. And then she goes to seek refuge in the Buddha. The Buddha gives her instructions on the Dharma, and she practices the Dharma and goes on to become an Arahant later. So this is one story. So I want you to think about the lesson that one can draw. What was the essence of the advice that the Buddha gave to this person, Kissa Gautami, that would have helped her deal with the immense grief that she was in. So just think about it. Also introduce another story too. So this is the story of another lady, and there's some debate whether this is the same story about Kissa Gautami with a different name, or it's an entirely different story. But some of the details in the story are a little different. So let's just go through this incident. So Patachara, she was pregnant with a second child. She already had a young child, and she was returning to her parents' home along with her husband for the delivery of a second child. On the way, there was a great storm, and so the entire family paused to take shelter. So she requested her husband to organize a shelter, and the husband went around to collect some grass and sticks to build a shelter. But then, as he was cutting the grass, a snake bit him, and he died of the poison from the snake bite. Patachara kept waiting, wondering where her husband was. And in that unsheltered state, she gave birth to her second child. But she had to spend the entire night sheltering her newborn and the young elder son against the rain and wind with just her body, nothing else to protect them, but shelter them from the rain and the wind. So the next morning, she finds the dead body of her husband, and she's extremely distraught. So she decides to return to her husband's home, to her parents' home. While returning on the way back, she sees the river, which is swollen from the rain overnight, and it's blocking her way. She has to cross the swollen river now with two children with her. It's very difficult to cross the river. So what she does is she leaves the elder son on the bank of the river and then carries the newborn with her and goes to the other side of the bank navigates the raging current, carries the baby to the other side, and places the baby on the far bank. And then she is about to, she turns back to fetch the firstborn. Now, as she turns her back and is about to return, there's a huge bird, a big hawk, that sees this baby and decides it's a good meal, and swoops down on the baby and carries it off with it. So seeing this, Patachara, she kind of immediately she tries to shoo away the bird, raises her hand, tries to chase it away, but to no avail. The hawk picks up the baby and carries it off. Meanwhile, the firstborn on the other side of the river, on the other bank, um, seeing his mother raising her hand, he interprets it as a signal for him to cross the river. So he jumps into the river uh, with the raging current, and the raging current of the river carries him off, and he drowns and dies. Uh, so Padachara has now lost her husband and the two sons. Overwhelmed with grief, she returns to her parents' home, only to learn that the home has been burned down from a lightning strike in the previous night's storm. Uh, Her parents and brother both died, and at that, when she returned to her home, they were being cremated on a single pyre. So at this point, with all this loss that she's just experienced, she goes mad and starts wandering about half naked. And only when she comes in the presence of the Buddha, she recovers the senses. And the Buddha then teaches her the Dharma, and eventually she kind of attains the state of Arhant. So this is another story about immense grief being experienced by this lady called Patachara. Then there's another incident I would like to share with you. Another story from the sutras. So there's a lady called Ubiri. In her case, she comes from a high family, affluent household in Shravasti. And she was beautiful as a child. So when she grew up, she was accepted by the king of Shravasti, King Pasanedi. Later on, she gave birth to a daughter, whom she named Jiva. But shortly after being born, her daughter Jiva died. And Ubiri was overwhelmed with grief. Wounded by grief, she would go every day to the cremation ground and would mourn her daughter. So one day, while she was mourning her child's death, grieving her child's death, she she was at the cremation ground, and then she discovered that there was a large crowd that had assembled outside. And then she was told that the Buddha was traveling through the region and he had paused to give teachings to the local people. So then Ubiri stopped for a while. She listened to the Buddha's teachings, but her mind was distracted, and she soon left to go to the cremation ground and continued her ritual of weeping with despair. So the Buddha then, hearing her wails, pain-filled keening, sought her out and asked her why she was weeping. And in agony, the lady Ubiri uh, told him that her daughter had died. So then the Buddha then pointed out to one place and another in the cremation ground where the dead had been laid. And he said to her, "Mother, you cry out, O Jiva, in the woods. Come to yourself, Ubiri. 84,000 daughters, all with the name Jiva, have burnt in the funeral fire. For which one do you grieve?" So again, another story about a grieving person being advised by the Buddha. So try and think about what advice the Buddha was giving to these people. Okay, then there's another story that I would just like to share. So King Pasenedi or Prasenjit, um, he was the king of a kingdom called Kosala in northern India, and Shravasti was part of that kingdom. So the Buddha, he spent most of his almost 30 of his monsoon retreats uh, in Shravasti. So the Buddha was residing in Shravasti in Jetwan, Anath Pindika's monastery. King Prasenadi, the Kosalan king, went to the Blessed One, and on arrival he paid his respects, bowed down to him, and sat by his side. While he was sitting there, his attendant came and told him that his Queen Malika, had died. And then his demeanor suddenly changed. He was overcome with grief. He sat there miserable, sick at heart, face down, brooding at a loss of words. And the Buddha then saw the king in this miserable state. And he then gave this, he mentioned this to him. There are 5 things, great king, that cannot be gotten by a contemplative, a Brahman, a Deva, a Mara, a Brahma, or anyone at all in the world. So what are these 5? So may what is subject aging, not age. So if you wish that things do not age, things that are subject to aging, may they not age. This is something that cannot be gotten by contemplative, a Brahman, a Deva, a Mara, a Brahma, or anyone at all in the world. So that's the first thing that cannot be got. The second thing is, may what is subject to illness not grow ill. May what is subject to death not die. May what is subject to ending not end. May what is subject to destruction not be destroyed. So these are all things that cannot be got, the Buddha is saying. So things that are characterized by the property of aging, the possibility of illness, the eventuality of death, the eventuality of separation, the eventuality of destruction. You cannot reverse these. You cannot wish for not aging, no illness, no death, no end, no destruction. So whether you're contemplative or a Brahma, you can't get any of that. So these are the 5 things that the Buddha said you cannot get. So he speaks of a person who is not trained, and then how he responds to being united with these things, like illness. A thing that is subject to illness grows ill, and something that is subject to death dies, something that is subject to an end ends, and something that is subject to destruction is destroyed. So with the destruction of what is subject to destruction, the person is not able to reflect. What is he not able to reflect? He can't reflect that it doesn't happen only to me, that what is subject to destruction will be destroyed. To the extent that there are beings, past and future, passing away and re-arising, it happens to all of them. So that which is subject to destruction will be destroyed. So he's not able to reflect on this. And because of his lack of ability to reflect on this, he then engages, or rather, he begins sorrowing. He begins grieving, lamenting, beating his breast, becoming distraught. And because of these, although he knows that if he reacts in this manner, food would not agree with him. He would have these kind of physical difficulties. His body would become unattractive. My affairs would go unattended. There's some important work that I would not be able to attend to. And my enemies would be gratified. My friends would be unhappy. He's aware of all these consequences, but because he's not able to reflect on the fact that things that are bound to be destroyed, or things that have the property of aging, they cannot be reversed. And it is not something that only he experiences. It is something that everybody has to experience, whether it's from the past or whether from the future. Everybody has to experience this. And then on the other hand, a well-instructed disciple is able to make this reflection. And so with the destruction of what is subject to destruction, he does not sorrow, he does not grieve or lament, does not beat his breast or become distraught. So this is called a well-instructed disciple of the noble ones, who has pulled out the poisoned arrow of sorrow, pierced with which the uninstructed run-of-the-mill person torments himself. So there's the poisoned arrow of sorrow. The well-instructed disciple is able to pull it out, whereas the uninstructed torments himself with the consequences of the poison from the poison arrow of sorrow. So sorrowless, arrowless, the disciple of noble ones is totally unbound, is right within himself. So the Buddha then concludes that sutra into the sutra called the Kosalan Sutra. It's in the form of an advice to King Pasenadi. And he says that not by soaring, not by lamenting is any aim accomplished here, not even a bit. Knowing you're sorrowing and in pain, your enemies are gratified. But when a sage with a sense for determining what is his aim doesn't waver in the face of misfortune, his enemies are pained, seeing his face unchanged as of old. Where and however an aim is accomplished through eulogies, chants, good sayings, donations, and family customs, follow them diligently there and that way. But if you discern that your own aim or that of others is not gained in this way, acquiesce to the nature of things, and begin unsorrowing with the thought, what important work am I doing now? So this passage that discusses eulogies, chants, etc., is a reference to funeral customs. And these are designed to channel the feelings of the bereaved in a productive direction. So that's the reason, even we do these prayers, extensive prayers and dedications, seeking a good rebirth for our dear ones. That also could be considered to be bereavement in a productive direction. So grief in a productive sense. So as the Buddha notes, as long as these seem to be serving a purpose, engage in these. So eulogies, chants, good sayings, donations, family rituals and customs, engage in them. But once they no longer seem to serve a purpose, and one finds that one is indulging in grief. So if you're kind of indulging in grief, there's excessive grief, then one should return to important duties of one's life. So again, there's a lesson here. So let me ask you, so we've seen all these stories. Is there some lesson that you could identify through these stories? Any lesson that you could identify? Anyone?
First story seemed to point, the one with the mustard seeds, that seemed to point towards sort of realizing impermanence, or realizing that the effect of impermanence is that death will occur around us and to us,
Right.
I guess. And then
Okay.
the one that spoke about the Jiva daughter,
Yes.
that one seemed to a little bit like point to the limits of our both compassion and wisdom, in terms of like not realizing that all sentient beings, like our mother sentient beings, or should be worthy of the same sentiments or love and respect and so on, whereas we sort of arbitrarily select the ones that right now are connected to us in this life and ignore the others.
Okay. Yes. Yeah. Right. So the first one is you're speaking about. Okay. The first story about Kissa Gautami and Patachara, identifying something like there's a pervasiveness about death, or there's universality of grief that then results from death. And the second episode about Ubiri and Jiva, the person is not kind of sensitive to, or it doesn't, the person does not realize the affinity between self and others when it comes to these kind of experiences. She probably thinks that hers is an immense grief, and she's probably the only person grieving. And she's kind of, immersed in self-pity. And the third example, King Prasenjit, the Buddha specifically talks about these characteristics that phenomena have. The characteristic, if it is an animate sentient being, then it has the property of aging. It has the property of eventuality of death. So the Buddha is asking us to kind of remember those properties and regulate our response to any loss with that recollection, remembering those 5 properties. And he also says that bereavement, the process of grieving, as long as even if it implies engaging in some sort of bodily rituals, eulogies and funeral customs, as long as you deem them to be productive, you can engage in them. But if that process becomes overwhelming and you start indulging in grief, then you should realize that it's not going to be productive. Set it apart and should return to the important duties of one's life. So these could be the lessons that we could draw from the stories that we just looked at. So there's ubiquity of suffering. So there's suffering all around. You're not the only person who is suffering. And there's universality of grief. When there's not a person, there's not a household in Shravasti which has not experienced death, which has not dealt with death. So extending that argument, there wouldn't be any household in this world that has not dealt with death. So there's universality of grief. And then the Buddha also talks about an affinity between the lives of self and others. Ubiri, the advice that Buddha gave to her was that you should realize that there's affinity between the lives of self and others. And the other lesson that the Buddha is giving is that one should shun longing for permanence in all aspects of life. So the 5 things to remember that he said, things that we cannot have. So we want to have them because we long for the permanence. What are these things? Youth, health, companionship, resources, etc. And the Buddha said that these things, phenomena, have the property that you will be, they will be kind of destroyed. Their good qualities will come to an end. Things could, if they're sentient, then they will die. They're subject to aging, so youth will be lost. So you cannot grasp at the permanence of these things. So you shun longing for permanence in these aspects: youth, health, companionship, resources, etc. So although we seek stability and predictability, be ready for change. And then be mindful of excessive grieving. So being overwhelmed with grief is destructive. So to the extent that the process of grieving, if you do engage in certain kinds of customs and rituals, chanting, etc., if it is productive, then persist with it. But if it leads to a point where you started indulging in excessive grieving, then leave it behind, park it. And because it does not bring any benefit to the departed person, and it also compromises you physically and mentally. So being overwhelmed with grief is destructive to oneself and brings no benefit to departed person. So these are some of the lessons that we could draw out from the stories that we just looked at. So in the Buddhist interpretation of grief, we look at grief. Grief can be understood as the suffering of suffering that is experienced as a result of the suffering of change. So you're all familiar with the 3 kinds of suffering. So there's suffering of suffering, the suffering of change, and there's all pervasive conditioned suffering. So the first 2 are the manifest suffering. The third one is more subtle, and it's the underlying principle that provides the basis for the first 2. So grief is actually suffering of suffering that is experienced as a result of suffering of change. So what is the suffering of change? If some person that is dear to you has passed on, has departed, that alters the environment that you've been comfortable with. And that change then leads to all these emotional responses that you experience. And those emotional responses are part of the grieving process. So that is, those emotional responses are the suffering that you experience. And so the grieving process is the suffering of suffering in reaction to the suffering of change. And then a point that Alice referred to at the start of the discussion, grief also demands reassessing your identity. So we have this very fixed concepts of our identity. So defined in terms of the professions that we are part of, the kind of education that we've done, the place that we inhabit, the family that we have. So, because all of this is subject to change, we grasp at these things, assume that these are permanent, but these are all subject to change. And hence, you should also be open to the possibility of carrying an evolving identity. So the world that you're so comfortable with, any slight alteration in this world makes it completely unrecognizable. So if a person that is very close to you, a friend who's very close to you departs, the whole world around you that you were comfortable with, that becomes unrecognizable. And hence, any identity that you define for yourself in relation to this world, that changes. And it is bound to change because the factors that define your environment, your world, those are subject to change. So you need to be aware of that, and hence you have to be open to the possibility of evolving identity and not grasp at an identity. So you need to reassess grasping at an identity. So these are some of the things that the texts speak of when they present grief. So what are the techniques that we could use to deal with grief? So the first thing that we could do is think about the properties of death, decay, sickness, aging. Think about how these properties are intrinsic to us, how these properties are intrinsic to the people who are dear to us, how these properties are intrinsic to the environment that we abide in. And based on an understanding of this, this characteristic, that death, decay, sickness, and aging, these are intrinsic to us and our environment, we can enhance our endurance, our tolerance of pain by having this organic acceptance of whatever pain manifests, whatever hardships or adversity manifests. So based on this understanding, on this realization that things are characterized by the property of decay, our dear ones are characterized by the property of sickness, aging. Our dear ones are characterized by the property of eventual death. And you can accept these as an inherent, intrinsic property of these things, and that acceptance will help you to have some sort of an enhanced tolerance, endurance towards pain that may manifest if any of these are altered. So that's one thing that we could use to design some sort of. That we could do is develop an understanding of the impermanent nature of things, impermanent nature of phenomena, animate as well as inanimate, and also things unsatisfactory because they arise in through causes and conditions, and because they're conditioned with permanent pleasure. So in that sense, they're unsatisfactory. They cannot satisfy your need for pleasure or happiness. So you have an understanding of these concepts of impermanence and unsatisfactoriness of things. And based on that understanding, you can enhance your tolerance towards pain and hardship and other adverse situations. So enhanced endurance resulting from reflecting on the nature of reality. The nature of reality being understood through impermanence, and unsatisfactoriness of phenomena. Then the other thing that you could do is you could also look at why, because loss triggers all these emotional responses, leads to a lot of sorrow. And that suffering then triggers something in you. It triggers a certain kind of spiritual awakening in you. Experience the spiritual awakening if there was no suffering in your life. If you are, then it's almost impossible to kind of develop this awakening, spiritual awakening. So in that sense, it is helping us. So we should look at grief as a spiritual teacher. It awakens our spiritual consciousness like none else. So these are the three different dimensions along which you could evolve response mechanism for the experience. So enhance endurance based on organic acceptance. That is the first one, acceptance. Second one is enhanced endurance resulting from reflection on nature of reality. So acceptance, and then second one is recognition of the nature of reality. And the third one is identifying grief as a spiritual aid, spiritual teacher. So, use these three realizations to design your response. So let's see the first one, the acceptance, organic acceptance of and hardship. So there's a sutra called the Upadnyasthana Sutra. It talks about the subjects for contemplation. So it says, the Buddha says that there are 5 facts that one should reflect on often, whether one is a woman or a man, lay or ordained. So what are these 5? You should reflect that I am subject to aging. I have not gone beyond aging. So this is the first fact that one should reflect on often, whether one is a woman or a man, lay or ordained. The second fact that one needs to reflect on is I am subject to illness. I have not gone beyond illness. Third fact is I am subject to death. I have not gone beyond death. The third fact is I will grow different or separate from all that is dear and appealing to me. And the fifth fact that you need to be aware of, I am the owner of my actions, heir to my actions, born of my actions, related through my actions, have my actions as my arbitrator. And whatever I do for good or for evil, to that I will fall heir. So you're conditioned, and your responses are conditioned, and then those actions, your responses will have consequences. So these are the 5 remembrances that the Buddha asks us to reflect on. So in order for us to develop enhanced endurance to pain through organic acceptance, as we just seen, you need to kind of be aware of the properties that characterize phenomena, the property of aging, the property of illness, the property of death, the property of eventual separation, the property of destruction, the property of consequences to your action. So these things, if you're properly in recognition of, then it can lead to an organic acceptance of pain, and that would lead to enhanced tolerance of pain. So the second one was knowing nature of reality. Again, we spoke of how we need to understand the impermanent nature of phenomena and also understand the unsatisfactory nature of things. So this again, we would do by study of such scriptures. So there's the scripture called the Anitya Sutra, or impermanence. So the sutra says, the 3 kinds of feelings, O monks, are impermanent, compounded, dependently arisen, liable to destruction, to evanescence, to fading away, to cessation. So what are these three kinds of feelings? There's the pleasant feeling, the painful feeling, and neutral feeling. So all these feeling, whether it's a pleasant feeling or a painful feeling or a neutral feeling, these are impermanent, these are compounded, these are dependently arising, liable to destruction, to evanescence, to fading away, and to cessation. So if you're aware of these things, these properties, then if you're aware of this nature of reality, then it will help you develop more enhanced endurance to pain. And that would help you with the grieving process. And then the other thing that you need to be aware of is that all contaminated things are suffering. So the 4 or 5 stories that we saw, they spoke about the ubiquity of suffering. So this suffering is ubiquitous. Why? Because things are contaminated. Why do we say that they're contaminated? They're contaminated because they arise through conditioning by karma and afflictions. So anything that is conditioned by karma and affliction has the potential to be the cause of suffering. So if you have an understanding of this aspect of reality, then enhanced endurance in the process of grieving is possible. So this is the second one, knowing nature of reality. And then before we look at the third one in detail, the third one was to see grief as a spiritual teacher. And then we also saw how grief triggers a awakening of the spiritual consciousness, a spiritual awakening. Now, in order to understand that, you just need to kind of just reflect on a few things. So we are all familiar with the 12 links of dependent origination. So this is the normal presentation. So the first link of ignorance triggers conditions, acts as a supporting condition for compositional factors, and so on, till the 12th link of aging and death. So birth leads to aging and death. Is the rebirth is the 11th factor, 11th link, and 12th link is the link of aging and death. So this is how the 12 links are presented in the sutras, the Rice Seedling Sutra and all those different sutras. There's a slightly different variation of this presentation in a sutra called the Upanishad Sutra. So here, the 12th link is replaced by suffering. So the link is usually aging and death. But aging and death is not the only form of suffering. So there's other kinds of suffering that you would experience. So the 12th link here in the sutra is presented slightly differently. It's called suffering here. And this very sutra then also has this very interesting presentation of this 12 links. So this is a more worldly order, the worldly order of these 12 links. So there's a transcendental order of a different set of 12 links linked to these 12 links, but that releases a person from the cycle of samsara. This causal sequence speaks about a sequence that keeps you bound in the cycle of samsara. So this is the other causal link, causal sequence. So the transcendental order. So here in this very sutra, the Buddha says that suffering acts as a supporting condition for faith, for the development of faith. And faith then becomes a supporting condition for joy, which then becomes a supporting condition for rapture. That becomes a supporting condition for tranquility, happiness, concentration, knowledge of suchness. That leads to disenchantment, dispassion, emancipation, and that then finally leads to knowledge, which helps you remove the contaminations. So this is the causal sequence, which leads to release from samsara. So it's a transcendental order as opposed to the mundane order on the left. in both causal sequences, there's of course the second one, the one on the right, we're not really, it's not so popular. It's not so extensively spoken of as extensively as the first one on the left. But even with the one on the left, the sutra has replaced the 12th link. 12th link is not aging and death, but suffering. Now, what is it all leading to? So here is the sutra. Here's the causal sequence in the mundane order. So there's ignorance, there's the karmic formations, consciousness, mentality, materiality, or name and form. Then the sense spheres, and then the contact, feeling, craving, clinging, existence, birth, leading to suffering as the 12th link. That is the mundane order. And then the transcendental order, suffering acts as a supporting condition for faith. Faith then leads to joy, rapture, tranquility, happiness, concentration, knowledge and vision of things as they are, disenchantment, and that leads to dispassion, and vimukti or emancipation, and that leads to knowledge of destruction of the contaminations. So in the transcendental order, suffering is the supporting condition for faith. So in order for you to generate faith, whether it's in the three jewels, whether it is in the principle of law of cause and effect, law of karma, you need to have a comprehension of suffering. Suffering acts as a supporting condition for this faith to be generated. So this suffering then triggers a spiritual awareness in us, and the spiritual awareness and the desire for enlightenment that we have or we so desperately seek, that is very difficult to arise naturally in harmony or in consonance with our regular modes of engagement with the world. In our regular course of life, it's very difficult in the absence of suffering. It would be very difficult to have this spiritual awareness being awakened. But because of the presence of suffering, we have this awakening to spiritual growth. This awakening of spiritual growth, what it requires is some sort of adjustment on our side, redirection of our energies away from the innate, inherent urges for pleasure and enjoyment. What it needs is this awakening of spiritual growth. It needs some sort of us to encounter some sort of suffering. So this encounter with suffering is what triggers this direction triggers this redirection towards awakening or spiritual growth. So that's why we should look at suffering as a spiritual friend, a spiritual teacher, grief as a spiritual friend, spiritual teacher. So those are the kind of things that could help us in designing an approach, a mechanism to deal with grief. The other thing that could help us with dealing with grief is the practice of mindfulness. And all of you are aware of the 4 foundations of mindfulness. There's mindfulness of body. We practiced a little bit at the start of the session. Mindfulness of breath is what we practiced. So we observe the breath and remain mindful of our in-breath, out-breath, and we extend that kind of meditation. You observe your breath and you know when the breath is long, when the breath is short. So that is the first foundation of mindfulness. The second one is mindfulness of feelings. So whether you're experiencing a pleasant feeling or a painful feeling or a neutral feeling, you remain mindful of that. You observe the sensations on your body, and sometimes you experience some pleasantness. Let's say you're sitting in a hot room and there's a cool breeze that blows across the room, and then you experience this momentary kind of pleasant sensation when the cool breeze touches your body. So you experience that pleasant feeling and you register, okay, now this is a pleasant feeling has arisen. But it's also temporary, and the breeze then dies, and then that pleasant feeling, pleasant sensation then vanishes. So now you make a note, you're mindful, okay, the pleasant sensation has vanished, disappeared. So you contemplate your feelings in this way. Remain mindful of your pleasant feelings and painful feelings. Remain mindful of your neutral feelings. So this is the second foundation of the mindfulness of feeling. Then the mindfulness of consciousness and mindfulness of mental objects. So when you speak of mental objects, contemplation of the mental objects, so when anger arises or desire, sensuality arises, or when you feel very lazy, lethargic, the sloth and torpor, or this your mind is very agitated and worried, anxious, or if there is doubt in the mind, when any of these conditions manifest, then you register these. You say, this is present, and you know with understanding that I have anger, or I have desire, I have sloth, I have agitation in my mind, I have doubt in my mind. And when these are not present, you register that, okay, anger is not present or sensuality is not present. So that way you make a note, you're mindful of the arising and the cessation of, or the non-arising of these mental objects. And that's how you cultivate the mindfulness of mental objects. So these are the different kinds of mindfulnesses that one could cultivate. And practice of mindfulness using these four foundations can help us in the process of grieving. So when you grieve, and let's say you are in the phase of this acute grief, and all these acute emotional responses manifest. So if you practice mindfulness, start with mindfulness of breath, and then you proceed to observing your feelings. And when that practice becomes a little more solid, then you can proceed to practicing mindfulness of mental objects. So when you practice the contemplation of mental objects, you know, okay, sadness is arising, or frustration is arising, or whatever, and then you stay with that object. You do not make any kind of judgment. Let it pass. Yeah. And then you make a note, and as you cultivate this practice of mindfulness, you become more aware about the entity of these emotions, these kind of responses. uh, and then because of enhanced awareness of these things, automatically you would be able to kind of you'll find that the negative impact of some of these things have on your mental being, on your physical being, that gets diluted a little bit. Of course, by itself, it's not sufficient. Mindfulness meditation has also to be, uh, augmented, complemented, supplemented with your practice of wisdom and that. So this is another thing that we could use to deal with grief. So let's now just summarize the discussion that we had so far, and just remember the first slide that we'd looked at. So there we had identified the grief attendant cluster with all the attendant emotional responses when we are grieving. So the sadness, anxiety, guilt, fatigue, etc., etc. And then we spoke about what could be part of the grief cushion cluster. So through our discussion, what we've seen is that if we recognize the impermanent nature of phenomena, if we recognize the ubiquitous nature of suffering, if you accept the universality of grief, and if we cultivate enhanced endurance through these cognitions, through these recognitions, and if we practice mindfulness, all these things could help us cushion our grief a little better. So the grief cushion cluster could have cognizance of impermanence, cognizance of ubiquity of suffering, acceptance of the universality of grief, enhance endurance through uh, enhance acceptance, enhance endurance through knowing the nature of reality, and enhance endurance also by realizing that grief could be a spiritual teacher. And then through the practice of mindfulness of breath, mindfulness of consciousness, mindfulness of mental objects, and mindfulness of feelings, this could help you develop a better kind of response to loss, uh, ensuring that the grief does not kind of does not become overbearing, does not become overwhelming. Uh, Whatever positive aspects of grief there might might be, you can focus on that. The negative ones can be dealt with. So that's the discussion on grief. That's all I have. So we'll pause here. We'll just stop here. So if there are any questions, maybe we can take them, or else we can just end with a short dedication. So if you have any doubts or any questions, and if you want to ask them, you can either ask them now or later maybe. If you can just post them on chat, and then you can take those questions in later sessions, in a subsequent session. Yeah, Alice, good.
Yes, on the previous slide, when you were speaking about the summary of the techniques and so on, would it be a correct interpretation that essentially these are useful when we are dealing with people? The last one, actually, sorry, this one, yeah. These are useful when we have the Buddhist worldview, and that if we don't, then it might be more difficult to use them to help others. Like the reason why I'm saying it is that in the previous session we had last week, we were speaking about resentment, right? And I really felt like, oh yeah, this is really amazing that it's in a way for us to build common language with people around us who may not be Buddhists, right? But they have the kind of everyday language of resentment and so on in relationships and so on. And here I thought maybe it might be similar, but when I think about it, like if you look at, for example, impermanence, outside of the context of the precious human rebirth and the ability to actually do something about your conditions and your future lives and so on, then impermanence is actually quite, like if it was outside of that context, then it's actually quite depressing, right? And same way, the ubiquity of suffering, if you have no way out of suffering, if you don't have access to the Buddha Dharma, is also quite depressing, right? And so on and so forth. So would it be correct to say that is essentially kind of like how I'm reading this is that unless you have access to the Buddha Dharma, or maybe in the Indian context to some other views that, or some other, spiritual streams that share some of the views, then really you are kind of doomed, right? Not doomed in the sense like these won't be super helpful to you without that view.
Yeah, certain aspects of the approach that we've discussed here, some of those aspects could, be deemed to be secular. Doesn't have to do anything with religion or any spiritual tradition. So, for example, the practice of just being observant of the emotions that you are experiencing, being mindful, not necessarily a practice that is connected, associated with a spiritual tradition. You could do that. You could be observant. You could have, a very dedicated kind of attention. Those kind of things could be done out of this context, out of the context of a religious tradition. Those kind of things could be explained, articulated without using any kind of the religious spiritual jargon that we used here, maybe. But I also have to bring out some things that are unique in terms of the approach that we can have to deal with grief. Some things that are unique to Buddhism. So that's the reason, I went through all those stories and the lessons that we could learn from the stories. So certain aspects of this approach could definitely be articulated in the manner that the religious jargon is left out. Example, acceptance of the universality of grief also, you don't necessarily need to use religious or spiritual jargon to articulate it. Impermanence, again, if you think about the subtle aspects of impermanence, okay, it becomes a very uniquely Buddhist kind of concept. But we talk about gross impermanence, and most of us are aware of it at some level. Most of us do accept it at some level. It's just that, like for example, all of us know that death is an eventuality that we'll have to deal with at some time. It does not. But what we do is we say that, okay, at some point in my life, I'm going to die, but I'm not going to die tomorrow. I'm not going to die next month or the next year. So we still grasp at permanence in that sense, but it's a very gross kind of grasping. So the antidote to that would be a concept of impermanence, which is again gross. And that need not be, that again can be articulated without using any kind of religious or spiritual jargon. So in those, through use of those kind of terms, you could cut out either completely or maybe dilute the religious jargon being used to articulate these approaches. Yeah.
I just want to clarify, I didn't mean it as criticism at all.
No, of course
more
not. Yeah,
as a realization as
right.
Yeah, I just meant it more as a realization that, like, thank goodness for having met Dharma, because without that, a lot of these tools wouldn't be at all available, or it would be difficult to access them. Yeah, just to clarify. Thank you.
Any other question?
Venerable, there's a question in the chat.
Okay.
By Shunya.
Shunya Bharti, as a formal daily seated meditation practice, is breath meditation enough, or should analytical meditations also be practiced along with it? If yes, what can one start with as a beginner? Okay, breath meditation. Okay, so I assume that you're familiar with different kinds of meditations. So broadly, two categories. There's meditation that helps you with enhanced concentration, and then there's meditation which leads to insights. So in Buddhism, we speak about shamatha, that enhances your concentration, and then vipassana, which leads to insights. Now, without cultivating insights, or without engaging in meditations that would lead to insights, vipassana, it would be difficult for us to address the problem of suffering at its source. The Buddha said that ignorance is the root cause of all our suffering. And in order to remove ignorance is some sort of a misknowing of phenomena. So in order to correct that, we need to know it properly. And that knowing properly is the insight part. And that comes through vipassana, or the analytical meditation. So breath meditation, to the extent that it only enhances your concentration ability, is not a sufficient meditation. You need to complement it with analytical meditations. And there are analytical meditations that we do during the course of our discussion. Usually we start with breath meditation to help with stilling our minds, just helping with concentration. But then we meditate or reflect, contemplate on death and impermanence. We cultivate mindfulness of the 8 freedoms and the 10 endowments that now present existence is characterized by. So we do those kind of meditations also. And then we also do meditations on bodhicitta. So these are analytical meditations, but for a beginner, I think breath meditation to help you with concentration, definitely necessary. And then analytical meditation would be cultivation mindfulness of death and impermanence, because that gives you the impetus to then invest more of your energy and time in practicing the spiritual path. So you need to kind of invest some time in cultivating mindfulness of death and impermanence. So that would be a good starting point for. It's also a supplementary meditation would be the optimum human rebirth. I spoke about the 8 freedoms and the 10 endowments. So those things, if you could incorporate that meditation also in your meditation routine, then it will definitely enhance your meditations. Okay, any other question? All right, so maybe you'll stop here. Just do a short delegation. So just relax in your posture, keep your back erect, and shoulders straight, arms relaxed. And just take a moment to reflect on the discussion that we've had so far. So we started off by examining the nature of grief, the entity of grief. Then we saw that grief can be defined as a response to loss. So we also examined what kind of response there could be. We then went on to identify the different kinds of losses that could lead to grief. And then we saw what are the different kinds of grief. And if we could identify stages of grieving. And then when we saw how the Buddhist scriptures present grief. So we looked at different sutras and went through specific episodes of grieving that some of the Buddha's disciples had, and the advice that the Buddha gave them. And then from the advice that the Buddha gave, we then drew some lessons from those sutras. And then based on those lessons, we try to design an approach, a framework to deal with grief. So just reflect on all these things. Just take a moment, just a minute to reflect on it. Just recollect it. Okay, now so through this discussion, we invested some of our time and resource in being part of this discussion. And because it's a virtuous activity, we've accrued some merit through it. So let's just direct that merit. So due to the merits of these virtuous actions, may I quickly attain the state of a Guru Buddha and lead all sentient beings without exception into that enlightened state. May the supreme jewel bodhicitta that does not arise and grow, and may that it does arise and not diminish but increase more and more. Okay, Namo Buddhaya. So thank you, all of you. Thank you for your time and patience, and
Thank you very much, Kalila. Thank you very much.
see you around next time.
Yes,
Okay.
we look forward to welcoming you at CKSL. End of the month, you're coming to CKSL, right, Bangalore?
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.